I would like to welcome you for week 4. We are engaging in different theodicy, which are basic attempts to theologically make sense of our suffering world. We'll examine this week the last 4 theodicy that Richard Rice has pointed out in his book. The most widespread theodicy is the free will model. This theodicy basically argues that God created humans so that they could respond in love, faithfulness, or obedience to Him. Humans must be genuinely free to choose how they desire to respond to God. To have a free will means that the consequences are a world that is good and evil. The free will theodicy sees suffering in this world because some of God's creatures misuse their freedom. So from this point of view, God is not responsible for the mistakes humans make, nor the suffering that these mistakes leads to, because God is not the one who contributes to the courses of events. Because if there should be free will among humans, then God cannot place limits or even intervene in human history. For example, if God would intervene to prevent evil that will naturally cause to limit our freedom, of course. So it is logically impossible to open up a person's freedom without at the same time giving him the opportunity to choose morally wrong. The possibility of doing something morally wrong is part of human freedom. But of course, some philosophers have debated if there is any proof that people actually can freely decide. They also said it could also be a wish, or rather a verifiable fact, that we are actually free. On the other hand, some have asked why there is no natural law that prevents us from killing each other or killing even ourselves. In that sense, it is physically and logically impossible to create a world with better natural laws without limiting the evolutionary development of humans. The free will defense develops from the early works of Augustine, who was later followed by Thomas Aquinas and others, that basically have argued that God is not the author of evil, but allowed it in order to achieve greater good of human freedom and love. Peter van Inwagen summarizes it like this, quote, "The omniscient God who knew that, however much evil might result from the elected separation for himself, the gift of free will would be, so to speak, worth it. For the existence of eternity of love depends on this gift, and that eternity outweighs the horror of the very long, but in most literal sense, temporary period of divine-human estrangement." End of quote. Richard Swinburne is one of the main advocates of the free will defense. Regarding to the evil in the world, he says, quote, "The less God allows man to bring about large-scale horrors, the less the freedom and responsibility he gives them. We are asking God to make a toy world, where things matter, but not very much, where our choices can make a small difference, but the real choices remain God's. For He simply would not allow us to the choice of doing real harm. And He will be like an overprotective parent who will not let his child out of his sight for a moment." End of quote. The free will defense for Swinburne is that death, despite the suffering it causes, is essential. Death means that life and the changes that each life contains are limited. This is essential because only in a limited lifespan can we have genuine responsibility of our actions. Swinburne argues that if we are immortal, with infinite changes, then there will be no temptation. If there's always another chance, then there's no risk. However, Swinburne would not agree with Iran's view of the universal salvation, noting that, quote, if you cannot damn yourself, no matter how hard you try, your salvation will be inevitable, making a toy world again. End of quote. According to this view, the radicality of divine fidelity and the ultimate seriousness of God's invitation to love is demonstrated by the fact that God uses nothing but the means of love to win his freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre puts this very well, quote, the man who wants to be loved does not desire the enslavement of the beloved. If the beloved is transformed into automaton, the lover finds himself alone. End of quote. German theologian Klaus von Sosch points out that the fundamental intention of God, and therefore the intention throughout which his action can be attributed, is the intention of self-commitment of his love, as it has been fundamentally shaped in the person of Jesus Christ. God's intention is therefore realized all the more as the more determined a human acts out of love. Love, which itself is not manipulated externally, can be definition only be found in an autonomous decision. If therefore God's intention is liberating love, and love is only a reality when it comes out of a free consent, God can only assess his attention within the world through acts of liberation, and love that do not manipulate creatures' freedom and love, but affirms and thus encourages them. God's sovereignty in history is therefore carried out in the constant promotion of the unreserved love of humankind, which he has not been manipulating. God's will, therefore, not to negotiate or limit the freedom of humans at any point of time. For von Stosch, then, it is evidently that God has decided not to carry out his good will without the mediation of his creatures. This is precisely the highest appreciation of human, that not only being the object of the love of God, but that humans are empowered to express the love which is God to others, and therefore to the reality of the divine action may be granted. So Klaus von Stosch notes that at this point it is of little importance to divide human and divine action into a competitive relationship. Otherwise, at the same time, God's action would have not introduced into a relationship of love, which he in himself and therefore free man. So this introduction must be conceived as a concrete manifestation of the divine will in each individual human life, without the liberation of man or woman being abolished. So then how do we speak of God's actions when human freedom decides for each other? The point of the dialogue personal relationship between God and human consists, at this point, is the more human realize their freedom, the more God acts in them. And the intention of divine freedom becomes a reality through human. So when a person loves, God acts through them. And the more people change the world through action from the attitude of love, the more God's intention become reality within His creation. Klaus von Stosch points out that human gains true freedom and autonomy precisely when they give space to God in and around Himself, and when he is supported by God in his own extraction of space. Karl Rahner emphasizes again and again the direct proportional relationship of the divine and the human reality. According to Rahner, the creature is free and powerful when it lives near God and binds itself to the free will of the loving God. Human freedom and the inner world reality of God, therefore, grows to the same extent, a determination of proportion which comes to its unsurpassed climax in the person of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, Timothy Keller points out that the biblical teaching on the nature of freedom thus sharply differs with the modern view. The free will theodicy is very popular today, which may be found partially because our culture, the Western culture, inclines us to find it appealing. In the Western civilization, freedom and individual choices are something that is almost viewed sacred. However, Keller notes that God Himself is sovereign and free, and not just capable of love, but the very fountain and source of all love. Yet He Himself cannot be evil. God cannot be tempted by evil, as for example seen in James 1, verse 13 notes. God cannot deny or contradict His perfect righteousness or His holy character. Keller therefore asks, quote, if God has a free will, yet is not capable of doing wrong, why could no other beings also be likewise constituted? End of quote. Furthermore, humans are free only to the extent that we do what God built us to do, to serve Him. Keller therefore notes that the more capable we are to commit evil, the less free we are. Not until we attain heaven and lose capability to sin are we truly and completely free. Moreover, even God gives us the gift of free will. Scripture does note that God can sovereignly direct our choices in history without violating our freedom and responsibility for our actions. Keller uses the example of Jesus' crucifixion that was clearly foreordained and destined to happen. And yet all the people who, by God's plan, brought it about were making their own choices freely and therefore were responsible for what they did. Keller notes that this indicates that it is possible to be free and nevertheless to have our own course directed by God. On the other hand, we see Jesus being engaged in God, wrestling in agony with His own will. My Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours will be done. So God can give free will and still be involved in history. These just some thoughts on the free will theodicy. Let's move on to the second one that we are considering this week, which is the openness of God theodicy. Basically, this view holds that God doesn't foreknow the choices we make, only the possibilities. But how we actually exercise free will is only known to God when we act. So this approach has much in common with the free will approach. For example, Gregory Boyd would argue that evil, quote, cannot be captured in abstract definition, end of quote, but must be known in concrete experiences. He provides an example of a 7-year-old child asking, where is God when that child is being kidnapped, raped, and her dead body is left in a plastic bag beside a cold riverbed. He argues that before any serious answer may be given to the problem of evil, they should not be done in the abstraction, because they distract us from the reality of evil and reduce evil to just some statistic. Traditionally, classical theism has largely conditioned her adherents to accept God, who is omnipotent, but must allow this child to be brutally murdered for either some good purposes, for example, when we look at the soul-making theodicy or the perfect plan theodicy, or because humans have free will, the free will theodicy. Now, in Richard Rice, in an early book that is written entitled The Openness of God, the Relationship of Divine Foreknowledge and Human Free Will, there he notes that open theism calls into question the way in which the divine attributes have been traditionally defined. Language about God in Scripture, according to that open theist view, is not always intended to be anthropological or metaphorical. If God is immutable and never changes, then how, for example, is God sorry that he made humankind, as we read in Genesis 6:5? Or the pointing out, how does God change in his mind? Exodus chapter 32, verse 14. And what about the incarnation? John 1:14. Now Clark Pinnock, a major proponent of the open theism, says, quote, God is unchanging in nature and essence, but not in experience, knowledge, and action. End of quote. So open theists also call for a redefining of God's sovereignty and his foreknowledge. If God already knows the future exhaustively, and the future is predetermined, then, they would argue, free will is merely an illusion. Finally, open theists say that if God is in complete control of the cosmos, as proposed by classical theism, then he must be behind evil. Therefore, God could have done something about this particular 7-year-old child, but he simply chose to allow it for his good purposes. Krog Boyd argues that true freedom is incompatible with determinism. The belief that God can foreknow all things and that human can at the same time operate out of the free will is logically incoherent, according to him. This is a major point of contention for open theists. For Boyd, the future is partly open and full of possibilities. Only the past can be known exhaustively, for the past has gone. The present is ongoing, and the future is yet to come. If the relational triune God is love, then the very nature of love involves a certain level of risk. classical theists believe that this undermines God's sovereignty. Boyd argues a God who, quote, knows all possibility, experiences novelty, and is willing to engage in an appropriate level of risk is more exalted than a God who faces an externally settled future. End of quote. And Boyd believes that it is God's presence, that this kind of God is presented in the Bible. He points out that God knows the futures as unsettled possibilities. For example, in Genesis 23, verse 12, Jeremiah 3, verses 6 to 7, 2 Peter 3, verses 12, and in settled certainties. For example, Genesis 15, verses 13 to 15, Matthew 24, verses 1 to 32, or Ephesians 1, verses 3 to 10, where God invites human beings made in His image to join Him as agents of His new creations. So God perfectly anticipates the action of His free creatures and knows all that is knowable about the future. This view offers that the future is generally open. So the open view of God is God experiences things as they currently happen, and God's knowledge of events develop as events take place. So God doesn't see the future in all its details, because a great deal of the future is not yet there to be known. Rice notes that this does not mean that God knows nothing of the future, as He knows all possibility effects of the present causes, and also everything that could happen. However, in this view, God does not know the content of the futures according to the free decisions that are made in the present. Same like the free will theodicy, open theodicy places the responsibility of suffering on the decision of humans rather than on God. The third theodicy we have a look at this week is the definite God theodicy, or also known as the process theodicy, which is a theory that was created by Ian Whitehead and further developed by David Griffin, that states that God is not the creator of the world and is not omnipotent. The theodicy states that God is bound by the law of nature just like humans, and He coexists with us, but is not excluded from it. Of course, this is contrast to all of the classical theist religions, including Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so forth. So, God's involvement in creation, therefore, is limited. So, according to this theodicy, they would advocate that God is not really a divine celestial being, rather an internal force that has to abide by nature. God's role in creation was limited to start off the evolutionary process. And since the process has led to humans exerting their own power over this world, God no longer has total control, since humanity is free to ignore Him. At the same time, humans have very little knowledge of God's will, since He did not fashion them after His likeness. Those who advocate such a process theology would rather compromise on God being not all-powerful than on denying Him being all-loving. Why they call God a fellow sufferer who understands? Because God has no control of this world, but He is part of it. He too suffers when evil is committed. So His loving nature is seen by His supreme sacrifice in giving humanity the control over the world. He's a God who suffers with them to truly love us and give us free will. God has to suffer with us. God cannot stop evil as God cannot stop the natural process from happening. However, God is responsible for evil occurring in an indirect way as God created the evolutionary cycle process that occurs throughout the world. Nevertheless, even though God cannot control the process, God does whatever is possible that the process gives off a harmonious effect without breaking the laws of nature, as God does not have the power to do so. This means that God is omnibenevolent, but not omnipotent. It also means that God is not omniscient, as God does not know what's going to happen and cannot stop it, as God does not know when evil can occur. The fourth theodicy we discussed this week is the protest theodicy, which is an expression of outrage against the terrible evil, claiming no God could permit such evil. A phrase carried in a concentration camp cell by a Jewish prisoner captured this well. Quote, "If there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness." End of quote. Another example of what a protest theodicy is found in Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov, where he talks about Ivan Karamazov discussing the problem of suffering with his brother, the priest Aloysia. He cites many examples of atrocity against children, including soldiers shooting babies for fun in front of their parents, and the case of a little boy who was torn to pieces by dogs for accidentally harming one of his dogs. Ivan says, quote, "And if the suffering of children go to swell the sum of suffering which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that the truth was not worth such a price. Besides, too high a price is being asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay such much to enter on it." End of quote. If God gives Ivan a ticket to heaven, Ivan notes he would refuse it out of protest against the innocent suffering of the children. Some have questioned whether this amounts even to a theodicy at all. Also, there is a paradox in that approach, as in one sense there is the instinct to condemn an act of cruelty, whether it may be in this case, whatever it may be. But this response necessarily implies the existence of a supreme moral being. But yet, in this whole idea that there is a moral being, protest theodicy would reject. So the only manner to justify an objective standard is to attribute it to a lawgiver, in other words, to God. So, in the last weeks we have examined 7 different theodicies, each providing a unique view of suffering and evil in this world. We have seen some important points of better understanding our topic, but also seen that each theodicy has some kind of weakness and shortcomings. Next week I will start to provide a brief overview of the strength and the shortcomings before we move more into a practical or a pastoral, a missional theodicy that is biblically grounded while providing some very important implications for our ministries and for our communities. Thank you again for listening to this lecture of this week.